Um, so I'm Elsa Youngstead. I'm one of the co-presenters today. My co-presenter is Meredith Favre. Meredith, do you want to do a quick intro as well?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Good morning. So I'm Meredith Favre. I'm the local foods agent in Lee County, so in the Sanford area. And my background is actually entomology. I did my master's degree at NC State. So any opportunity I can have to talk about insects, I'm always excited. So me and Elsa have done a couple webinars together. So it's always fun to get in a room, either a virtual room or a physical room with folks who are excited about learning about native bees. So happy to be here today. Thanks for tuning in.
Cool. Thanks, Meredith. So we'll be tag teaming kind of back and forth throughout the presentation today. As far as my background, I also studied entomology in grad school. I'm now a professor of applied ecology here at NC State, and I run a lab that studies urban ecology, especially of bees and ants. So while we've still got a few people trickling in, we wanted to start out with just a little poll. Meredith, do you want to launch the first poll? Just so that we can get a sense of kind of why you're here. We're here to talk about bee hotels, and we're curious, how that caught your attention. Do you already have one? Maybe you want to make one for sort of a public garden or educational situation. Maybe you want to make one for yourself. Maybe you're a beekeeper, a gardener, just curious, and wanting to learn more. So we'll give the poll a few more seconds. We've got lots of answers rolling in. And then we'll get started in just a minute. So it looks like everybody who's in the room has answered. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results. I think that's shared now, right? Can everybody see the poll results? So it looks like we're a solid mix, a lot of gardeners, but also folks who already have or are interested in making bee hotels for different reasons, and some just curious. No beekeepers in this group, or at least nobody who wants to claim that as their like main reason for being here. So thanks for sharing your motives. And I will go ahead and get started with our content. Starting with the sort of most basic level of background, what exactly is a bee hotel? Those of you who already have one know this, but to make sure we're all on the same page, like this is a picture of a variety of styles of bee hotels. So these are all examples, and we'll talk more about sort of what makes a good one versus maybe a less sort of healthy living environment. And we'll get to that, but for now, sort of the basic point is all of these are really just nest boxes. They're basically like birdhouses, only for solitary bees. Bees that would use a bee hotel are bees who would typically be nesting in hollow stems or in beetle burrows and deadwood, sort of pre-existing tunnels in the environment. And the reason we might provide a bee hotel is because we tend to clean those things out of our environment, the dead stems and the deadwood. And that can reduce the available habitat for solitary wild bees. So we might want to just, as sort of a conservation, with conservation motives, put some of that habitat back in the environment. There can also be benefits to us if these bees are pollinating our vegetable gardens or our sort of natural plant communities. They can also just be fun to watch. And they are an important research tool that's used by researchers who want to know more about sort of bee life cycles and what benefits them or doesn't in the environment. And there are also some citizen science projects that will actually ask anybody with a bee hotel to sort of report who is living in it. So those are some of the kind of potential motives for having one of these nest boxes for bees. So for the rest of today, this is kind of our outline for the hour to come. I'm going to turn it over to Meredith to give us some background on bee diversity and biology in North Carolina. We're maybe all sort of familiar with honeybees, bumblebees, maybe a few others, and Meredith is going to fill us in on the vast diversity of other kinds of bees in the state. And then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of bee hotels themselves. Who are some of the specific species that will live in them? We'll do a few like resident profiles. And then we'll talk about some of the considerations for materials, design, placement, and then maintenance. So with that, I will turn it over to Meredith. Oh, wait, not quite. Before I turn it over to Meredith, I wanted to add most of what we are going to show you today is actually in this document that we published a year or two ago at this point. This is available for free online as a PDF or in HTML. You can find it at go.ncsu.edu/b-hotel or with this QR code. And so you don't have to take a ton of notes today. We might cover sort of a lot of information, and part of the goal is just to make sure that you're aware that that information is out there and know where to find it again. So you don't have to panic with note taking. You can also check out this document. Okay, now for real, I'm going to turn it over to Meredith to tell us about bee diversity. And Meredith, just let me know if I need to change the slide and I'm not doing it.
Will do. Thank you, Elsa. So yeah, really excited today that everyone's online and excited to learn about our native bees. This image here on the slide really shows some of the diversity that we have in body styles and color and shapes that we have for our native bees. So there's lots of different ones. They pollinate all different types of plants and a little bit differently. And as a group, as a team, if they're a pollinator team, they're much more effective than one single generalist species like a honeybee or a bumblebee that uses lots of different flowers. So variety is the spice of life, and the variety of our native bees really does help with the pollination services that we get both in our agricultural landscapes and our natural landscapes. And just to put some numbers on the bee diversity that we have. So in the world so far, and again, these numbers are always changing, which is exciting. We have characterized up to 20,000 different species of bees. And in North America, it's around 4,000. So in our state alone, I remember when Elsa and I started doing this webinar, this is much lower. We are now at 560 different species of bees in North Carolina. So I think that's crazy every time I look at that number. And in the Triangle area where North Carolina State University is located, you can find a little over 100 different species. And then within a single yard, over 70 different species of bees, especially when it's nice and warm outside. So just putting some numbers to diversity. And now we'll do our second poll of the day. And so with this diversity of body styles, colors, and shapes, we actually see two different bees that are shown here. One looks very wasp-like, right? And this is a Nomada species, and it's a parasitic bee. And we also have our carpenter bees, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So with these different varieties of colors and shapes, what really defines a bee? What makes bees different from wasps? And so that's our second poll for today, and I'm going to go ahead and launch that. Which of these characteristics do you think makes a bee a bee? And mark all that apply. There might be one correct answer. There might be multiple. So mark all that you think apply. Oh.
Nope, this is not the
wrong
poll
poll.
we think it is. I think
Oh,
we went poll 3.
let me try that again. Let me try the other one. Let's try poll 3. There we go. Perfect. So go ahead and chime in which responses you think are correct and mark all that apply. So A, only bees pollinate. B, only bees have branched hairs on their bodies. C, bees have narrower waists than the wasps. And then D, only bees feed pollen to their larvae. It looks like we've almost got everybody answered. We'll wait just a few more seconds for the last few folks to respond. Okay, I will go ahead and end the poll now and share the results. And so y'all did really well. So the correct answer, actually, are B and D. So only bees have branched hairs on their bodies, and only bees feed pollen to their larvae. So we'll learn as we're going through the webinar today that all bees have somewhere on their body branched hairs, and they are vegetarian wasps. So they are a branch of the wasp family tree that just eats pollen and nectar. So we can go ahead and stop sharing. So we've touched on what defines a bee already. So we have two different types of bees that are shown on the left. And like we discussed already, bees have branched hairs somewhere on their body, and this allows them to collect pollen when they're out foraging. And the bees, again, are vegetarian wasps. They're a branch of the wasp family tree. And while wasps will feed their larvae different types, and that's the juvenile bees and no juvenile wasps. They will feed their little babies, the larvae, crickets and caterpillars. So they're carnivorous. So wasps actually have carnivorous larvae. Bees, on the other hand, their babies, their larvae, are vegetarian. So they will eat pollen and nectar. And that's what we see up at the top right. And that square is actually a bee larva that is feeding on a pollen provision. So this is like a pollen nectar loaf that the mother will make for them. And somewhere on the bees' bodies, they have these specialized branch hairs that essentially works like Velcro to lock on to pollen as the bees are foraging and to help them bring it back to the nest. So it's important to think about the life cycle of bees, because when we're wanting to conserve them, we need to make sure we're providing habitat and providing resources for all the different life stages of a bee. And so often we're seeing bees when they're out foraging. That's the most common situation when we're seeing them. And we might be lucky enough to see them when they're nesting as well. And that's what's shown here. This is a leafcutter bee, and she is putting leaves in her nest to line her nest and make her chambers. But the rest of the life cycle, we typically don't see. We're not really able to look within the hive unless you've got an observation hive, which we'll talk a little bit about those today too. But the tunnels, the nests, we typically don't see what's going on there. But we have an egg. Bees will lay eggs like other insects, and bees that are using bee hotels as well as reeds and tunnels are going to be laying one egg per chamber. So everyone gets their own room, and they have their own pollen and nectar loaf that's all they need to grow. They can just munch on that. And when they become a larva, so again, an immature bee, their job is to just eat. They're an eating machine. And when they have eaten enough, they will become a pupa, and they're undergoing these big body changes at that time. They're becoming more adult-like, and then they will eventually pop out, and you have an adult who will continue the life cycle, will go out and forage and make her own nest. And so that completes the whole life cycle of a bee. So for the sake of time today, we could talk about bees all day. Literally, me and Elsa have done longer discussions, longer presentations, and we would touch on social organization and diet in these. And we're happy to answer any questions that you have about those at the end of the webinar. But we're going to focus on nesting location today because today is about bee hotels. So we have a variety of different nesting styles, I should say, for our native bees, and the majority are ground nesting. And so 76% of the bees species that we found so far make tunnels in the ground, just like these mining bees. We actually have a Halictus bee that's on the left, and her nest has been partially uncovered. And so we see her right there, probably like, why did they uncover my nest? And then we also see an egg here that looks like a oblong, like banana shape. That is a bee egg on a pollen provision. So that's what it looks like when you uncover their nest. And then we also have mining bees who have these nesting aggregations in the spring. And that's what's shown at the top right. And they look like little ant turrets, little holes in the ground. And I know some people get a little nervous. They're like, oh, is that fire ants? Are they just setting up shop in my yard? But that is in fact mining bees that are setting up shop, which is great. And they're some of the first bees that come out in the spring. I actually have some in my neighborhood that pop up every year, and I love to see them because they kind of like spread around the neighborhood. But if you look up close, this is actually a cellophane bee at the bottom right, who is also a ground nesting bee. You can see them popping their heads out and foraging around. And so that's the majority of our native bees, are these ground nesting bees. And in essence, when we're thinking about our ground nesting bees and providing habitat for them, a good rule of thumb is leaving exposed undisturbed soil, because they need to be able to get access to the ground, right? So if we've got mulch, if we've got landscaping fabric, that can be a deterrent because the bees can't get to the soil. So in general, it's good to leave some areas that are exposed, undisturbed. But then beyond that, really our native bees vary in their different requirements for nesting. Even the ground nesting bees are going to have differences in whether they prefer clay soil, more sandy soils. So having a variety is always nice. And one way that we can support bees, if you want to make something in your yard that kind of provides a lot of different variety in types of soil and ground environments, is this herb spiral that's shown here. And while we don't have research to support this, supporting our native bees through experimentation, in essence and in concept, it makes sense because you're providing different types of slopes, different types of soil and exposures, and also incorporating rocks. Some species really like using river rocks as well, or will nest around river rocks. So you can add an herb spiral to your garden. It looks nice and in essence should provide a lot of different habitat for the ground nesting bees. And so now we'll move into cavity nesters, which bumblebees are kind of this interesting category of native bees. They kind of are cavity nesters, and they kind of just like to use other homes of other animals. So for example, they like birdhouses, rodent burrows. They'll also nest under tussocks of grass. That's actually shown up at the top left is an uncovered bumblebee nest where we've got little wax pots where the honey or the nectar and the pupae would be. So they like to nest in a lot of different environments. So if you have an old birdhouse or maybe there's a rodent burrow, you might want to check it to see if you have some bumblebees that are there, but they can also be under your grass as well. And now we move into the stem and wood nesting bees, and this is really where our bee hotel residents are. So we've got our different Osmia species of bees. These are mason bees, and that's what's shown in the top left. These are blue orchard bees, and it looks like they are, they're in close proximity to each other, but each bee is using her own tunnel. So they all are solitary and using their own tunnel, even though they can nest pretty close together. And then we've got these green metallic sweat bees that are in the bottom left corner. This is an Agochlorella species that was nesting in rotten wood. And this is kind of a cross section of the whole nest where you can see different stages of development, with the one on the right being the most developed and the one on the left being more in the pupal stage. We also have our small carpenter bees, which is the top right. That's Seratina, and they will chew pith out of stems and make their little compartments using that. And their cousin, the carpenter bees, at the bottom, which is the only native bee that will drill into sound wood. All other native bees do not do that. And carpenter bees do not eat the wood. They literally will just leave sawdust trails behind it. But those are the only ones who maybe are a threat to your deck. Okay, and now I'll pass it back to Elsa to talk about what goes on inside and to talk about a little bit more of the residents too.
Well, thanks, Meredith. So yeah, before we launch into specific residents, I want to take a quick look at kind of what goes on inside those nesting tunnels. Like we've seen in the last slide, kind of what it looks like from the outside. But if you took one of those nesting tunnels, either a reed or a tunnel in the wood, and split it open, what would actually be in there? And so what happens is the female, there will always be sort of an open end and a closed end, and the female bee will go in through the open end and she'll head back toward the back and kind of put her own backer somewhere in the tunnel. In this case, this bee is one that uses chewed up leaf pulp as a material to make sort of the linings inside the nest. So this is a little leaf pulp partition. She might make a couple layers. And once she's satisfied with the back of the nest, she'll start collecting pollen and add pollen and nectar into that nest chamber until there's enough to turn an egg into a bee adult. So then once there's enough, she lays an egg on it, and then we'll build another partition and then proceed toward the front of the nest. So as the nest develops, you get kind of a time series of different age bees. So now we've got the one in the back has become a pupa. In this species, they make a cocoon. And then in the front are the most recently laid eggs. So these bees do need a nesting tunnel, but they also need these additional materials. They're not solely working with the tunnel. They've got to go collect leaf pulp, or for some species, mud or resin, to be able to construct the nest interior. And then, of course, they have to have abundant floral resources to be able to get enough pollen to make these provisions. Each nest represents basically hundreds of foraging trips by one female bee to collect all of the materials needed to fill it with the food for her larvae. So now that you've kind of seen how a bee hotel fits in the bee life cycle, and kind of what's going on inside the tunnels. We'll look at a few of the specific residents that might turn up in a bee hotel if you have one. One of the most sought after groups of residents are mason bees in the genus Osmia. You had another shot of these on one of Meredith's slides. The famous one is the so-called blue orchard bee, Osmia lignaria. This is a species that you can buy from gardening catalogs. You can order them online. They're well known as orchard pollinators, and people in fact rear them, like especially out west, like for almond pollination, people will rear them on a large scale and take like truckloads of bee nests to the orchards for them to emerge and pollinate on a commercial scale. But if you're working just on sort of a personal garden or landscape scale, you don't really need to buy bees. If you put the nesting materials out and conditions are right, they'll show up because Osmia lignaria is a native species here, and it's a different subspecies from the one out west that you might find in a gardening catalog. Besides that one famous Osmia, which is the one shown here, they're a nice metallic blue. We also have 21 other species of Osmia in North Carolina, most of which are native. They range in size. So they'll use sort of tunnel diameters of 3 to 13 millimeters, or like about 1/4 of an inch up to 1/2 an inch. And then their construction materials for the nest interior will be either mud or leaf pulp. This is a photo of one that's used leaf pulp. So each little partition between the nest chambers is made with sort of chewed up leaves. And most of them are pretty generalist foragers. Some of them have a strong preference for fruit trees, and that's why they're sought after as orchard pollinators. Unfortunately, we do have some non-native Osmia that are becoming more common throughout the East Coast, so I wanted to just quickly acknowledge their existence. If you do put out a bee hotel, you are likely to see these bees using it. They're becoming more common than the native blue orchard bee, and there's not a lot that a bee hotel provider can do about that at this point. They have very similar sort of requirements. They're about the same size as the native bee. They use the same tunnel size. They forage on similar resources. They both use mud as their construction material. But in terms of recognizing them, they also do have kind of a bluish green metallic sort of integument, their skin. But they have a much more sort of golden fuzziness on them. They're more likely to be mistaken maybe for a honeybee than for the native blue orchard bee. So you may see these bees in and out. Not a lot to do about it at this point, but be aware of them. Another group of bees that will take up residence in bee hotels are the Megachile, the leaf-cutting bees. They tend to be active a little later in the summer than the Osmia. They show up around May, and some species are even active into November. In North Carolina, we have 37 species. Again, a few of these are introduced and will show up in bee hotels. The most famous introduced one is the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, which is also reared sort of commercially at scale for alfalfa pollination. But it's also sort of a generalist, like good garden pollinator. So it's another one that you can purchase from catalogs if you want. In general, we recommend sort of creating the habitat and seeing who shows up rather than purchasing bees. As a genus, Megachile will use tunnels of about 5 to 8 millimeters in diameter. There actually is one species that'll go much bigger that's not native. And then they use as construction materials a range of stuff. Leaves are the most common. Some of them will chew up leaf pulp, like some of the Osmia, some of the mason bees. Some of them cut little pieces and basically line the nests and use those little pieces as sort of wallpaper. And then some species will use resin or pebbles. And if you do want to support leaf-cutting bees in the environment, they've got to also be able to find the right leaves. In general, they're not super picky about which leaves they will use, but they do like ones that tend to be kind of soft and not super hairy. So some examples of common plants that leaf-cutting bees will use are rose, redbud, grape, greenbrier also, although I can't really see use like planting that on purpose in our gardens, but it is one that they'll use if it's available. Buckwheat is another good one. So that was Megachile. It's also worth mentioning the small carpenter bees. Sorry about the text wrap format thing on this slide. It says small carpenter bees. They're active really kind of throughout the year. You can see them on warm days, even in like January, February. They don't typically turn up in bee hotels, but I want to mention them kind of because they could, if we manage them differently with these species in mind. The reason they don't normally is because most of the nesting materials we put in a bee hotel are completely hollow, whereas like Meredith mentioned, Ceratina needs to use the pith from inside the stem to build the little walls between the nest chambers. And so if we put pithy stems in our bee hotels, there's a chance that this bee could also show up, or if we just manage sort of perennial stems in the garden with these bees in mind, they'll occupy sort of the previous year's growth of perennial stems. So they use pretty narrow tunnels. These are small bees, like grain of rice sized bees. So they use a whole diameter of just 3 to 5 millimeters. They're good generalist foragers. They're kind of small and slippery, so they don't carry the most pollen compared to some other species, but they are common and they have the potential to contribute to sort of pollination in the system. And then the last resident I wanted to mention is another tiny bee, Hylaeus, the yellow-faced bees. They're also active in the summer to fall. And we've got 13 species in North Carolina, but they all kind of look like this. They're little black bees with yellow markings. And they look quite sleek and wasp-like because they actually carry their pollen inside in their crop to bring it back to the nest instead of packing it on the outside of their body, so they don't have all those fluffy pollen-carrying hairs that we're used to seeing on most bees. And then the other sort of outstanding thing about them is the material they use to line their nest. This is a photo of a Hylaeus nest, and you see it's filled with all this kind of cellophane-like material. They basically use spit secretions to come out liquid, and then when they dry, it makes this sort of cellophane-like waterproof nest lining. So they make their own construction materials instead of having to forage for, leaves or mud. So those are a few of the bees that you might meet in a bee hotel, and I will now turn it over to Meredith to talk a little bit about the wasps who might live in a bee hotel.
Yes, I know we've highlighted a lot of bees today, but we will touch on some of the wasps, and don't be alarmed. I know a lot of times when people think of having wasps in their bee hotel, they're like, oh no, I'm going to get stung, like I'll be in my garden and they're going to come and sting me. And I want to put you at ease that the wasps that are using your bee hotel are not as aggressive as, your yellow jackets and your paper wasps and your hornets. As we'll learn about, they are a more gentle wasp to have around, and they actually provide a really great garden service. They are, again, foraging different insects and arachnids for their larvae, so they can provide you a little bit of pest control at the same time. So for some of the wasp residents we're going to touch on today, these are the mason and potter wasps, our thread-waisted wasps, and square-headed wasps. And they're typically around a little bit later in the year, predominantly in the summer from May to September, compared to some of our native bee hotel residents. And we will launch our last poll for today for this question. So now that we know a little bit more about the bees that are using our bee hotel, I want to see what y'all think about the wasps. Are the wasps that are using the bee hotel social or solitary? So social being these big nesting aggregations, thinking about the yellow jackets and paper wasps and things that typically have, big nests that we see either in the ground or up top. What do you think the wasps that are using bee hotels are doing? Are they social or are they solitary? So let me deploy this last one. And I hope this is the right one. Let me see. Okay, so there we go. So are wasps that use bee hotels social or solitary? All right, we've got almost everybody in. I'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, everyone was very quick on that one. And drum roll. Good job, y'all. Almost everyone said solitary, and that is the correct answer. So the wasps that are using our bee hotels are in fact solitary. So they're not making these big groups that we think of with the yellow jackets, the paper wasps. Honeybees and bumblebees are also social. But yeah, we're dealing with solitary wasps in this case, just like our bee hotel residents who are bees. So cavity nesting wasps are, again, solitary and not as aggressive as our social wasp that we think of with those paper wasps, the hornets. They typically have up to 2 generations per year. So you're going to be seeing a couple different series of adults. So they'll be able to complete their life cycle, which they overwinter as larvae, typically undergoing diapause. Essentially, they go into a hibernation state. And then when it warms back up again in the spring, they'll come back out, they'll finish development as adults, and then they'll have another life cycle that goes through typically that year. So we're dealing with at least 2, if not more, generations per year of wasps using the bee hotel. And as I mentioned, they overwinter as larvae. They will store paralyzed arthropods. So this is our insects and our arachnids like spiders in the cavities with their larvae because their larvae are carnivorous. So that's what they use as their food source. And the wasps, because they have stingers, will use their stinger to paralyze the insects and the spiders so they don't put up a fight when they put them in there. And like bees, the female wasp will often lay, this is kind of a fun fact, they'll lay male eggs in the outermost cells and the female eggs on the innermost cells because males typically take less time to develop than females. So that's kind of a fun fact. So what's really fun, and this kind of applies for both bees and wasps that are using bee hotels, is you can get a good indication of who might be using your bee hotel based on the front door. So this is from a study where they were looking primarily at Osmia species. So we're talking about our mason bees. And mostly the Osmia species, but we've also got a Megachile in here. And then we also have a wasp nest. And a lot of times wasps are going to be using kind of more smoothed mud. That's what the outside is going to look like. While maybe our Osmia lignaria, again, our blue orchard bee is a little bit more lumpy mud. Our Megachile species is going to have leaf pulp interspersed in there. And every door is going to look a little bit different too, but there's a lot of leaf pulp being used for these Osmia species as well. And if you take a cross section of the different tunnels that we see, sometimes you can tell what the wasp tunnels look like based on the provisions that are in there. So if you see caterpillars like the one at the top, this is actually Eudinaris megara. We'll learn about this one in the next slide, which is a Potter mason wasp. And there's caterpillars actually stored in the different compartments there. We also have some pupae that are shown. This is a Isodontia, so that's a grass-carrying wasp. Then bees further down, kind of like the next 3 are different bees. And all the way at the bottom as our carpenter bees, if you can see those giant pupa, it's a good indication you got the carpenter bees because they're so big. So for our big group of Potter and mason wasps that are using our bee hotels, this is in the family of Vespidae. So this is actually the same family as our yellow jackets and our paper wasps. But again, these are the less aggressive residents of that family. And they get their name because some species are making these little nests out of mud that look like vases that's shown up at the top right. But for our residents that are in the bee hotel, they are using tunnels, just like our native bees are. And so this is a variety of the different Potter and mason wasps that we can find in our area. They are active from May to September. And you have some really big species, sometimes like Menobia quadridens, which is the 4-toothed mason wasp. It is the biggest nesting vespid that we see in the eastern United States. So it's a big one. It uses the biggest diameter that we see, typically around a 12.7 millimeter size hole. So some of the biggest ones. In contrast, Simorphus right here is one of the smallest species you're going to see of this group. They're very small, using some of the smallest diameter holes. We have some more colorful ones as well, like this Patogenaris urinus, which is the only species of this genus in the United States. So if you see a red one, it's pretty dead ringer for this particular species. And then some Enstestoceras different wasps as well that are black and yellow. And they are caterpillar predators primarily, and they can lay their eggs on a little thread within their chambers, which is really interesting. Our next group is Sphecidae, which is our thread-waisted wasps, and I bet you can tell why they get their name. Their waist is very small. Oftentimes it's very, very constricted. They're black and blue in coloration primarily, and this is where our grass-carrying wasps are. This is our Isodontia genus, and again, they're pretty self-explanatory. They will use grass to to stock their tunnel. And you can often see the females flying around with a blade of grass, which is really cool. And then you also have some smaller species like the Soliarella species here, very, very small. And these Sphecids are spider predators. Or actually, they are grasshopper and cricket predators. Our next ones are spider predators. So that's how you can kind of tell them apart if you're looking at the tunnel. Okay, so this is our square-headed wasps. Again, these are our spider predators. They used to be lumped in with Sphecids. As entomologists, sometimes we're lumping and splitting different groups. So they look similar, but they're in their own special group now. And they typically will use beetle burrows, beetle tunnels in natural settings, but they will use our bee hotels as well. They're more active from June to August. And one of the most famous of the wasps from this group is the Oregon pipe mud dauber, but this is the only species that actually makes their tunnels from mud. The rest are in this tunnel. They use the bee hotels. The ones we're talking about today are using these kind of nesting tunnels. So what if wasps are using your bee hotels? Hopefully we've assured you today that this is a great thing to have. Again, wasps are pollinators in their own right, as well as providing some prey or some pest control for you. So no need to worry. They are going to be great for your bee hotel, and making everyone feel at home is great for both the bees and the wasps. Providing different diameters will provide great habitat for both your large wasps and your smaller wasps. So they're very colorful, very fun to watch. So it'll be great if you have wasps using your bee hotel. And now I'll pass it back over to Elsa for design considerations.
All right, thanks, Meredith. So now I want to spend a few minutes, if you've decided that this is a group of bees and wasps that you would like to sort of support in your environment, and you're going to put out a bee hotel, what are some of the things that go into making that both an attractive and a healthy place for these species to live? And so the first consideration is just which general type of bee hotel are you going to make? We've kind of divided them into three main groups of designs, all of which have kind of some pros and cons. One type you'll see are the wooden block type, which could be just a solid block of wood with holes drilled in it, like this one on the right. These can be super attractive. They will be occupied by bees and wasps, but they're really hard to clean. In fact, you can't do it unless you put paper liners in the tunnels. So I would only recommend using these if you do put liners in the tunnels. Otherwise, they just sort of accumulate parasites and pathogens and can't be cleaned out. An alternative that's easier to clean are these grooved board style ones where you stack a series of boards with grooves on them. The grooves align and make tunnels. So when it's time to clean out, you can just unstack them and clean and disinfect. But we find these to be pretty unattractive. When we've put them out around Raleigh in our studies, only about 4% of these tunnels have been occupied compared to up to like 50% of more preferred materials. So pros and cons. Another sort of variation on the block type construction is observation nests, which are basically like the grooved boards, except instead of having another board stacked on top, you just have a layer of plexiglass with a little door over it to keep it dark and cozy when you're not looking in. But when you want to see what's happening inside, you can remove the door, look through the plexiglass, and see what your bees are up to. These also tend to be a little bit less attractive than the fully closed tunnels, but you know, they will eventually get occupied. I've seen bees in them. Obviously, this person got bees in theirs, and it can be worth it for the fun of being able to actually see what's going on inside. And you can order, you can buy these, you can make them, like they're available on the internet. And then the last type are the sort of bundled tunnels. This is what we've had the best success with when we've put out bee hotels around Raleigh. You can use purchased materials or locally foraged materials. The sort of constant is that you do need something with a closed back end and an open front end. In terms of purchased materials, reeds and bamboo are kind of the most attractive and safest materials. You can also purchase cardboard and paper tunnels, but we don't recommend those unless you're using them as a liner inside a wooden block. If when they're deployed sort of on their own as a nesting bundle, they just get riddled with parasites. They're little parasitic wasps who can just put their little eggs right through the cardboard or the paper, and the bees inside suffer a really high parasitism rate. So if you want to use tunnels that you purchase, I would go with reeds or bamboo. Bamboo can be harder to split if you were in a situation where you wanted to open up your nests at the end of the season and see what was inside, then you would want to go with reeds. And then in terms of local materials, you can forage like perennial stems. You can leave the pith in, or you can remove it part way just so there's a little bit as a backer. You'll attract different species depending on what you do. The one thing you absolutely don't want to use, in addition to like not really recommending the paper and cardboard alone, there's no case where you really want to use a plastic straw. Bees will occupy them, but they're not breathable and they suffer a really high mortality due to mold. So these are no good, like even as liners of a different kind of tunnel, just no plastic. And then if you don't want to make the choice between a block versus a bundle, you can kind of have it all in one of these shelters that contains different kinds of nesting materials. I would just caution, kind of don't go overboard. Something like this is very hard to maintain and keep healthy. It would be a major effort. And there is in fact some research for some species showing that groups of more than about 100 tunnels in one place become less attractive to some bee species and also become a bigger signal to parasites that are looking for bee nests to parasitize. So keep it small, keep it manageable. Another sort of consideration, like when I started out, I was describing, most of these bees would normally be nesting in hollow stems or in dead wood, and we're putting bee hotels back in the environment to replace those missing nesting resources. We could put those nesting resources themselves back in the environment. If you didn't want to mess with building and maintaining a bee hotel, you could also be intentional about the types of plants that are growing in your landscape. Some examples of plants that produce pithy stems that will be occupied by bees include sumac, elder, sunflower, rose, blackberry, raspberry. The list could go on. They just won't occupy these things while that twig is or stem is still alive. They'll occupy it after it's been sort of broken and dried out. So if you're dealing with perennial stems, you can cut them off a foot or two above the ground, like in the winter, and then the following spring, bees will start occupying those dried stems. Another couple of sort of non-traditional ways of providing nesting resources that you can consider if you've got a bunch of perennial stems that you want to tidy up but don't want to throw away. I've seen people make these nice little wattle fences out of them, and bees will continue to nest in these until they kind of disintegrate. No research on this, but it seems like a clever idea. It does get used, and they disintegrate sort of quickly enough that they shouldn't be around a long time accumulating parasites. Also keep an eye on your woodpile. If you have a woodpile, sometimes it exposes the ends of beetle burrows and bees will come along and use those. I've got some logs in my woodpile. It's like a big X on them. Don't burn this one because I saw bees nesting in it this past spring. All right, so those are kind of the basic designs of bee hotels or bee hotel alternatives that you could put in your environment if you decide to go with an actual bee hotel. Some of the specific design considerations within it. One of the biggies that will determine who lives in your hotel is the diameter of the holes that you drill in it. Anything from about 2 millimeters to 13 millimeters, or about up to ½ an inch, will get occupied by somebody. Individual species have different preferences. So if you're looking at sort of instructions for blue orchard bees or alfalfa leaf cutting bees, you'll be given very specific diameters, 19/64, 15/64 inches. If you want to attract those specific species, you want only that size. But if you're looking to support a diversity of bees and wasps, you want your diameters to range in size. Why does the diameter matter? Of course, different diameters will attract greater diversity, but also it affects the sort of success of the insects living inside. So if a bee kind of doesn't have the right size available, she will use something that's too small, but even a ½ a millimeter too small in diameter means that she'll produce fewer offspring and also fewer females, because the females are bigger, she'll switch to males sooner. Whereas if she starts using a tunnel that's actually too big for her, she'll have to sort of do more remodeling, add more mud and leaves around the edges to make it fit, which kind of wastes her time. Then the length of the tunnel also matters. We don't have research for very many species on this, but we know for some of the commercially reared species that tunnels of sort of 3 to 8 inches in length are optimal. Why the length matters, I mean, different species will prefer different lengths, but also, like Meredith said, they put the females in the back and the males in the front. And if the tunnel is too short, they kind of get to that male zone sooner and won't produce as many females. And of course, the females are kind of like the limiting ingredient for the population. So you want good female production to keep a population going. So tunnel diameter and length will determine who you get and how successful they are. Thinking about a mother bee sort of navigating to this nest, recognizing her, like recognizing the nest, finding it, and then recognizing her own doorstep from, the 100 others around it. There's some considerations. Usually, a rule of thumb is that the entrance holes should be a couple centimeters apart. That can happen in 2 or 3 dimensions. If you're just drilling holes in wood, like they can be 2 centimeters apart. If you're dealing with a bundle where they're all crammed together, you can get that spacing by pulling some tunnels out and pushing some in, and that creates sort of a more recognizable pattern. Just don't move any of this while nesting is actively going on. If you're going to rearrange your tunnels, do it in the winter or sort of before nesting starts in the spring. Otherwise, they'll be confused if it moves. They're out on a foraging trip and they come back and things have changed. They can't find their own nest. As far as finding the nest itself in the environment, color can help. There's some evidence, especially for blue orchard bees, that putting the nesting bundle in a blue shelter is more attractive than other colors. And that's also true for alfalfa leaf cutting bees. Sometimes people will paint sort of black and blue and white patterns across the front of the bee hotel or on the sides to help it sort of stand out in the environment. Bees see blue really well. They don't, like red sort of appears as black to them. Once you've got your nest block or your bundle, you also want to put it in some kind of shelter to help protect it from the elements and also from woodpeckers. Woodpeckers can really destroy some bee hotels. You can be creative with this. There's not really research on what's a good shelter and what's not. You could use a common sort of utilitarian way is to put your bundle inside a PVC pipe. The pipe is not breathable, but if the materials themselves are, that's okay. A large piece of bamboo can work. Some sort of wooden box with a little bit of overhang to kind of keep the rain off is another good option. And then you'll also need to decide where to put your bee hotel in the environment. Again, this is something that's mostly based on sort of conventional wisdom and expert opinion, not a lot of actual research, but I'm going to share kind of some common tips and considerations. Usually want your nest entrances facing south or southeast so they get morning sun. That actually helps the bee inside sort of warm up faster, get an earlier start on foraging, and be able to be done before before things really bake in the afternoon. Usually bee hotels are placed sort of 3 to 5 feet off the ground on a post or on a shed wall or a fence post. There's nothing special about that height other than maybe convenient for people to look and maintain. I would say you don't want it on the ground where it's more vulnerable to other predators, and you don't want it blocked by vegetation. And then the last consideration on more of a landscape scale, most of these little solitary bees and wasps who live in here don't have a long flight range. They're mostly operating within about a city block of their nest when they're going off to look, excuse me, for mud or leaves or pollen or prey to go into their nest. So you don't want to put this sort of in the middle of a flowerless lawn situation. You want to know that within about a city block, there are other resources that these insects can use to complete the rest of their life cycle once they've found a place to nest. So those are some of the kind of design and placement considerations. A lot of that's unpacked in greater detail in that bee hotel guide that we showed up at the beginning. And now I'm going to pass it back to Meredith for more info on keeping your bee hotel healthy.
Awesome. Thank you, Elsa. And yeah, we're kind of reaching the end of our webinar. So let's bring it home. Let's talk about maintaining our bee hotel and making it sustainable for our bees. Nice and happy and healthy bees is what we want, and wasps. So thinking about their health and hygiene, we need to think about the threats that they might be dealing with. And Elsa already talked about woodpeckers, which is important to consider because they will try to clean out the bee hotel if they can. So providing some protective housing is good. So if you've got, that container, that PVC pipe, or the wood box that you're putting your tubes in, you can wrap that in a type of protective housing like chicken wire or hardware cloth that has, enough space that the bees can get in, but the woodpeckers cannot. So that's a great way to kind of help with deterring woodpeckers, is providing that housing around the bee hotel with that metal fabric, essentially. And then the next group, again, mold and pathogens. We've talked about this already with kind of considering your materials for what you're using, especially for your tunnel liners. As Elsa mentioned, no plastic straws. This will create a mold situation. And so having breathable material is important. So picking something with like woody stems or cardboard, or even the paper linings is good, but no plastic. And regular cleaning, of course, will help too, help keep your mold and pathogen levels down. For example, we have hairy-fingered mites that are shown at the bottom right. And this is what you can use to control them, is keeping that good hygiene, that regular cleaning, because these mites, while they don't feed on the bees directly, they are going to be eating the pollen reserves of the larvae, so they could starve the baby bees. And they also are really great hitchhikers, so they can hop on the adults and move to another tunnel. And then parasites. So we've talked about mites already. We have two parasitic wasps that are shown here, and they look, kind of like a bee, especially the one on the left, which is a Sapija species. This is 6 to 12 millimeters in size, so a bigger species. And then we have a smaller one. This is Montodontimeris, which is about the size of an ant, much smaller, but both of these will parasitize larvae. And so they can actually penetrate through 3/4 of an inch of wood with their ovipositor, which is shown really nicely in Montodontimeris. That rod essentially sticking out of the abdomen is their ovipositor. So they can stick that through a gap in the hotel or through wood. So that's something to consider, is having thicker sides can help with the parasitic wasps. And then cuckoo bees are what we call our parasitic bees. They will essentially go in and use tunnels of other bees. They will lay their eggs in tunnels, and then they will munch on the pollen reserves and things. And so essentially freeloaders using a home that's not theirs. So regular cleaning can also help with that. So how to clean your bee hotel. So let's say it's been a couple years. This is typically when we recommend folks consider taking their bee hotel out of service to do a deep clean, 2 to 3 years. And how you can do this is using an emergence box. So it doesn't need to be anything fancy. We have some photos on the side of different emergence boxes, basically an opaque box that you can put your hotel in, and it has one bee-sized hole. And the idea is we're going to put our hotel in, and the residents will eventually leave over time. So what you can do is, in the winter, take your bee hotel down that you want to clean, put it in this emergence box, and put it in a safe place that's protected from ants and spiders, because they will go after the bee larvae. You want to leave it in an unheated space like your garage or a shed, because we don't want the bees to warm up and think it's spring and start their development. When it's spring, go ahead and set that box outside. The bees and wasps will start to exit when it's their time. And by fall, everyone will have left the hotel. And so you can clean it or you can discard it, depending on the type of materials that you have. If you've got a design that you can clean pretty easily, a great way to do that is using a 1-part bleach to 3 parts water solution and soaking it for 5 minutes. If you have reeds or different materials like paper and cardboard, then those probably just discard those and just restock new ones. And as an alternative, you could actually open, if you have little reeds, the reeds for your hotel, you could open them up, refrigerate the cocoons, and do that all in essentially the winter time and be ready to go in the spring. So this kind of wraps up our portion. There's a lot of different resources out there. There's different websites like SciStarter. Feel free to tinker and come up with some fun different ideas for your bee hotel and tunnels. This is actually a picture of a spiral on the right that a bee is using, which is kind of fun. You can also buy, again, bees if you would like to buy some. There are different websites where you can do that. Crown Bees is another one that we have, I think, a photo of, but blue orchard bees, alfalfa leafcutter bees, as Elsa mentioned, are some that people will purchase for pollination services and for their hotels. And then there's lots of great resources out there. These are two different books that we recommend, but there's a lot of great resources. Bees in Your Backyard is really nice. It has great pictures, very easy to read. I always use it for my outreach materials because it's just a really great resource for kind of looking at all the different native bees that we have out there in an easy way. And then this is a resource from the Xerces Society. But lots of great stuff. Again, in addition to the publication that we've made, there's different websites, different resources like Sustainable Agriculture Research Education, or SARE for short, has a great publication on how to manage blue orchard bees. And again, I mentioned Crown Bees already. They're a great resource for materials for bees. So definitely check them out if you're interested. And that kind of wraps up our webinar for today. I know we are almost at 11. Me and Elsa get really excited when we talk about bees. So you have to cut us off with like a cane, you know, a comedy routine, but we have had a wonderful time. We'll maybe answer a few questions. And this is a QR code to our evaluation and needs assessment. We would love to hear how y'all felt about the webinar today, if it was helpful. And this also helps us with designing future programs. What are you interested in? What can we bring to you that you would be really excited to learn about? So, and we can also drop the link for that in the chat. Let me see if I can grab it real quick. But at this point, we can go ahead and I guess and open up for questions for just a little bit. And then Morgan mentioned, we can also answer questions after the webinar as well through email.
All right, it looks like there are a few questions in there, and I've actually put the link in the chat for everyone, the assessment link. I would say maybe let's answer one question and then we'll just save the rest for email because there's actually lots of great questions. So let's start with the first one. How do more developed bees get out past the less developed stage of bees?
Meredith, do you want to do this one or shall I take it?
If you want to go for it, go for it. I can always chime in.
Okay, yeah. Meredith touched on a little bit with the fact that they put the females in the back and the males in the front, and the males tend to be smaller and have a shorter development time. So that tends to even things up a little bit. Even though the eggs in the front were laid last, they develop faster and the males tend to come out sooner. There's also some kind of circumstantial evidence that even among the females, the bees in the back may develop a little more slowly, maybe because of the type of the food they were given, or maybe because oxygen doesn't get back to the back of the nest quite as much as it does to the front. So it ends up somehow working out that they mostly emerge in sequence. Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion with bees in the back walking sort of over, pupae that are in front of them, but for the most part, it ends up more orderly than you'd think.
Thank you. That's something I had never even considered before. And I just want to say that I have learned so much about the diversity of bees in North Carolina. It's been excellent and wonderful. And I just want to say thank you so much for presenting for us. For folks, just kind of a follow-up, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I will be sending a follow-up email with some links, resources, and other materials that may be helpful based on what we talked about today. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. We really enjoyed this presentation and we're glad that you were able to join us.